She walked into the downtown courthouse at 8:30 a.m. on what should have been a routine Monday morning, expecting nothing more than professional courtesy from the security personnel who were supposed to recognize that she belonged in that building more than almost anyone else. What she got instead was about to become the most shocking display of racial profiling and institutional bias that anyone had ever witnessed inside a federal courthouse, captured on security cameras that would make the footage go viral within hours and spark a nationwide conversation about racism in law enforcement that would dominate headlines for months to come. But Detective Carl Morrison, a man who had spent 15 years believing that his badge gave him authority over anyone he deemed suspicious, had absolutely no idea that the black woman he was about to harass, intimidate, and publicly humiliate was actually the Honorable Judge Victoria Washington, one of the most powerful federal judges in the state, someone who could not only end his career with a single phone call, but who would soon demonstrate exactly what happens when institutional racism encounters real federal authority. The woman entering that courthouse was Judge Victoria Washington, though Detective Morrison would never bother to learn her name or treat her with the dignity her position deserved, dismissing her from the moment she walked through those metal detectors carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of professional attire that should have immediately signaled to anyone paying attention that this was someone who worked in that building every single day. At 51 years old, Victoria carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had earned her position through decades of exceptional legal work, someone who had graduated first in her class from Harvard Law School and had spent 20 years as one of the most respected attorneys in the state before being nominated to the federal bench by the president himself. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and she wore the kind of understated but expensive clothing that reflected both her professional status and her understanding that in courthouses across America, black women in positions of authority had to be above reproach in every aspect of their appearance and behavior. What Detective Morrison couldn't have known as he watched Victoria pass through security that morning was that she wasn't just any federal judge arriving for another day of hearings and legal proceedings. Victoria Washington was returning from a 3-week vacation, her first time away from the courthouse in over 2 years, and she was looking forward to catching up on cases and reconnecting with the court staff, who had become like a second family to her during her 8 years on the federal bench. She had specifically chosen to arrive early, before the building filled with attorneys and litigants, because she wanted a few quiet hours to review the backlog of cases that had accumulated during her absence and prepare for what promised to be a busy week of high-profile hearings. But Detective Morrison saw none of this context as he observed Victoria moving through the courthouse lobby with the confidence of someone who belonged there. Morrison was a 15-year veteran of the city police department, currently assigned to courthouse security duty as part of a federal task force designed to enhance protection for federal judges and court personnel. He had built his reputation on being suspicious of everyone, trusting no one, and assuming that anyone who didn't immediately fit his preconceptions of who belonged in federal buildings was probably up to no good. At 43 years old, Morrison had never learned to examine his own biases or question his assumptions about who looked dangerous and who looked legitimate. The irony of the situation was staggering. Morrison had been specifically assigned to protect federal judges from potential threats, and he was about to treat one of those judges as if she were the biggest threat in the building. His job was literally to ensure the safety and security of people like Victoria Washington, but his racial prejudices had blinded him to the possibility that a black woman in professional attire might actually be one of the people he was supposed to be protecting. Victoria approached the elevator bank that led to the judicial chambers, the same elevator she had used hundreds of times during her years on the bench. She pressed the call button and waited, mentally organizing her day and thinking about the cases she needed to review. The building was quiet at this early hour, with only security personnel and a few early arriving attorneys in the lobby, creating the peaceful atmosphere she had been looking forward to after 3 weeks of vacation. But Detective Morrison had been watching her movement through the building, and something about her confident navigation of the courthouse had triggered his suspicions. In his mind, people who belonged in federal buildings moved differently, acted differently, looked, and Victoria Washington, despite her obvious professionalism and appropriate business attire, had set off every alarm bell in Morrison's prejudiced worldview. Morrison approached Victoria with the aggressive confidence of someone who believed he was about to prevent a crime in progress. His hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon as he closed the distance between them, his eyes never leaving her face as he prepared to demonstrate his authority over someone he had already judged to be a threat to federal property and personnel. "Excuse me, ma'am," Morrison said, his voice carrying the kind of aggressive politeness that left no doubt about who was in charge of this interaction. "I'm going to need to see some identification and an explanation for why you're trying to access restricted areas of this federal courthouse. This elevator leads to judicial chambers and other secure areas that are off-limits to the general public." Victoria turned to face Morrison, immediately recognizing the tone and body language of law enforcement officers who had already decided she was guilty of something before bothering to determine what crime they thought she had committed. 20 years of practicing law had taught her to identify bias and prejudice in all its forms, and she could see that Morrison had already categorized her as someone who didn't belong in the building where she had worked for nearly a decade. "I work here," Victoria said simply, her voice calm and professional despite the familiar sting of being presumed guilty until proven innocent. She had learned long ago that responding to racial profiling with anger or indignation only gave officers like Morrison an excuse to escalate their aggressive behavior, so she maintained the kind of composed dignity that had served her well throughout her career. Morrison's expression didn't change, except for a slight narrowing of his eyes that suggested Victoria's claim had only deepened his suspicions. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification to verify that claim. We have strict security protocols in this building, and I can't allow unauthorized personnel to access restricted areas regardless of what they claim about working here." Victoria reached into her briefcase to retrieve her identification, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid giving Morrison any excuse to escalate the situation further. As a federal judge, she carried multiple forms of identification, including her judicial credentials, her courthouse access card, and her official federal identification. Any one of us should have immediately ended this encounter and prompted an apology from Morrison. But when Victoria handed him her courthouse access card, Morrison examined it with the skepticism of someone who had already decided it was probably fraudulent or stolen. The card clearly showed her photograph, her name, and her title as United States District Judge, but Morrison's biases were so deeply ingrained that he couldn't accept the evidence right in front of him. "This could be fake," Morrison said, holding the card up to the light as if looking for signs of forgery. "We've had problems with people using counterfeit credentials to gain access to secure areas. I'm going to need additional verification before I can allow you to proceed." The accusation hit Victoria like a slap across the face. Here she was, a sitting federal judge with 8 years on the bench, being accused of carrying fraudulent identification by a courthouse security officer whose salary was ultimately paid by the same federal government that had appointed her to her position. The irony was so profound that Victoria almost laughed, but she understood that this situation was about to become a teachable moment about institutional racism that would have consequences far beyond this single encounter. "Officer Morrison," Victoria said, reading his name tag, "I am Judge Victoria Washington, and this is my courthouse. I've been working in this building for 8 years, and I'm asking you to step aside so I can proceed to my chambers and begin my workday." But Morrison wasn't backing down. If anything, Victoria's claim to be a federal judge only increased his certainty that she was running some kind of sophisticated scam. In his worldview, federal judges looked a certain way, talked a certain way, and certainly didn't look like the woman standing in front of him. "Ma'am, I've been working courthouse security for 3 years, and I know all the judges in this building," Morrison said with absolute confidence. "And you are definitely not one of them. Now I'm going to need you to come with me so we can sort this out properly, and if you refuse to cooperate, I'll have to place you under arrest for attempted unauthorized access to a federal facility." The threat hung in the air between them, and Victoria realized that Morrison was prepared to arrest a sitting federal judge rather than admit he might be wrong about who belonged in the courthouse. She was witnessing the kind of institutional racism that she had studied in law school, written about in legal journals, and seen described in civil rights cases, but experiencing it firsthand as the target was both infuriating and educational. Victoria made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to argue with Morrison or demanding to speak to his supervisor, she decided to see exactly how far his biases would take him. She wanted to document every aspect of this encounter because she understood that what was happening to her was probably happening to other people of color who interacted with law enforcement every day, people who didn't have her position or authority to fight back. "Officer Morrison," Victoria said, "I'm going to comply with your request, but I want you to understand that this conversation is being recorded by courthouse security cameras, and there will be consequences for both of us based on how this situation develops." Morrison either didn't hear the warning or didn't care, because his next words would become the most infamous statement ever made by a law enforcement officer in that courthouse. "Lady, I don't care who you think you are or what kind of scam you're trying to pull, but you're not fooling me. You can take your fake credentials and your attitude back where you came from, because you sure as hell don't belong in a federal courthouse." The words echoed through the lobby, captured forever on security cameras that would make them famous within hours. Morrison had just told a sitting federal judge to go back where she came from, while standing in the courthouse where she presided over federal cases and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. Victoria felt a surge of anger that she carefully controlled, understanding that her response in this moment would be crucial not just for her own dignity, but for the broader message it would send about how federal judges expected to be treated by law enforcement personnel. She was about to demonstrate what happened when institutional racism encountered real federal authority. "Officer Morrison," Victoria said, her voice now carrying the full weight of her judicial authority, "you have just made the biggest mistake of your law enforcement career, and I want you to think very carefully about your next words and actions." But Morrison was beyond the point of recognizing warnings or backing down from what he saw as a challenge to his authority. "Are you threatening me?" he asked, his hand moving closer to his handcuff. "Because if you are, that's going to add obstruction and threatening a federal officer to whatever charges we're already looking at." Victoria reached into her briefcase one more time, but instead of pulling out another form of identification, she withdrew her judicial appointment letter, signed by the President of the United States, and her official federal judge credentials in their leather folder. She placed both documents on the security desk where Morrison could see them clearly, then stepped back and waited for reality to dawn on him. "Officer Morrison," Victoria said, her voice now carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in courtrooms and legal proceedings, "I am the Honorable Victoria Washington, United States District Judge for this district. Those are my federal appointment papers, signed by the President. This is my official judicial identification, and you, sir, have just committed what may be the most spectacular act of contempt and disrespect toward the federal judiciary in the history of this courthouse." The silence that followed was so complete that Victoria could hear the hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant sound of elevator machinery. Morrison stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror, as the implications of what Victoria was showing him began to penetrate his consciousness. You're really a federal judge," Morrison stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am," Victoria confirmed. "And Officer Morrison, everything you have said and done in the past 10 minutes has been recorded on courthouse security camera. Your accusations about fraudulent credentials, your demands that I prove I belong in my own courthouse, your suggestion that I go back where I came from, all of it is now part of the permanent record." Morrison's face had gone completely pale, and Victoria could see sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the building's air conditioning. The confident law enforcement officer who had approached her with such aggressive certainty had been replaced by a man who clearly understood that his career had just imploded in spectacular fashion. Re-hook. But what Victoria Washington was about to do next would transform this moment of racist humiliation into a masterclass in judicial authority and institutional accountability that would be studied in law schools and police training academies for decades to come. "Officer Morrison," Victoria continued, "you are going to experience what happens when law enforcement personnel allow their biases and prejudices to override their professional judgment. But more importantly, you are going to serve as an example of why we need comprehensive training on unconscious bias and cultural competency for everyone who works in federal facilities. Morrison tried to speak, but Victoria held up her hand in the gesture that had silenced countless attorneys in her courtroom over the years. "I'm not finished. What you did today represents a failure not just of individual judgment, but of institutional training and oversight. You have been assigned to protect federal judges, yet you couldn't recognize one when she was standing in front of you. That suggests a problem that goes far beyond your personal bias." The lobby had begun to fill with early arriving court personnel, and Victoria could see people stopping to stare at the unprecedented scene unfolding before them. A federal judge was delivering what amounted to a public lecture on racism and bias to a law enforcement officer who had just humiliated himself on courthouse security cameras. "Your supervisor will be contacted within the hour," Victoria said. "Marshal's office will be reviewing your conduct, and this incident will become part of a comprehensive examination of security protocols and training procedures for all law enforcement personnel assigned to federal facilities." Morrison finally found his voice, though it shook with the weight of his desperation. "Judge Washington, I made a mistake. I was just doing my job, following security protocols. Surely there's some way to resolve this without destroying my career." Victoria looked at him with the same lack of sympathy that he had shown her just minutes earlier. "Officer Morrison, the time to think about the consequences of your actions was before you decided to tell a federal judge that she didn't belong in her own courthouse. You have had 15 years to learn how to treat all citizens with dignity and respect, and you chose instead to build your approach to law enforcement on assumptions and prejudices." As Victoria gathered her belongings and prepared to finally access the elevator that would take her to her chambers, she wanted to make sure Morrison understood the full scope of what was coming. "This incident will be reviewed by federal authorities, local police administrators, and civil rights organizations. Your conduct today will become a case study in how not to interact with members of the public, regardless of their race or apparent status." Morrison was now openly sweating, his expensive uniform wilting under the pressure of what he was hearing. "Judge Washington, please, I have a family, a pension, 20 years left before retirement. This one mistake can't destroy everything I've worked for." Victoria's response was swift and final. "Officer Morrison, you didn't make one mistake. You made a series of choices based on racial bias and prejudice. You chose to assume I was a criminal rather than a colleague. You chose to ignore my credentials rather than accept evidence that contradicted your assumptions. And you chose to tell me to go back where I came from, rather than acknowledge that this courthouse is exactly where I belong." The elevator arrived, and Victoria stepped inside. But before the doors closed, she delivered her final statement. "Officer Morrison, real change in law enforcement will come when officers like you understand that respect and dignity are not privileges to be earned based on how people look, but rights to be protected regardless of race, gender, or perceived status. I hope this experience teaches you that lesson, because it may be the most important thing you learn in your entire career." The doors closed, leaving Morrison standing in the lobby surrounded by court personnel who had witnessed the complete destruction of his credibility and authority. Within hours, security footage of the encounter would be requested by news organizations, civil rights groups, and police oversight committees. Morrison's name would become synonymous with the kind of racial bias that federal authorities were determined to eliminate from law enforcement. Judge Victoria Washington spent the next hour in her chambers, not reviewing cases as she had planned, but instead documenting every detail of her encounter with Morrison and preparing the formal complaint that would trigger a comprehensive investigation of bias and discrimination in federal courthouse security. Her vacation was over, but her real work was just beginning. The incident would lead to mandatory bias training for all federal law enforcement personnel, new protocols for identifying and addressing discriminatory behavior, and a complete overhaul of courthouse security procedures. Morrison would be reassigned pending evaluation, eventually retiring early rather than face the disciplinary proceedings that would have ended his career in disgrace. But the most lasting impact of that morning would be seen in the changed behavior of law enforcement officers who understood, perhaps for the first time, that assumptions about who belonged where could destroy careers, and that treating people with dignity and respect wasn't just good police work, It was a constitutional obligation that applied to everyone, including federal judges who happened to be black women. Final rehook, 6 months later, when Officer Morrison had retired in disgrace and Judge Victoria Washington had been appointed to head a national commission on bias in law enforcement. When the security footage of their encounter had been viewed millions of times and used in training programs across the country, when courthouse security procedures had been completely reformed to prevent similar incidents, the legal community finally understood what Victoria had achieved through her calm, dignified response to institutional racism. Sometimes justice comes not from angry confrontation, but from quiet authority exercised at exactly the right moment by exactly the right person. Morrison learned that lesson too late to save his career, but just in time to serve as an example of what happens when law enforcement officers forget that their job is to protect and serve everyone, regardless of race or assumptions about who belongs where.